Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. It's a visually impressive thing. It draws the entire planet of Earth, literally the entire planet of Earth, and unlike most games, which have a sort of inherently limited draw distance because you're on the ground and there's stuff in the way, Flight Sim kind of has to draw everything all the way to the horizon, and doing that while looking this pretty and doing skies this lovely and clouds that fluffy, well, it's a bit of a tough task on a GPU, and lots of people are worried about if their rig can even handle it. And like every other flight simulator from within its own series, and in fact every other flight simulator pretty much ever, it is a large, complex and sophisticated beast that can and will kick the ever-living bejeebus out of your PC hardware if you let it. But, as demanding as it can be, it's actually remarkably well optimized already. How optimized though? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Let's have a look. I have so far been running it on what you'd fairly call an enthusiast level gamer PC rig. But let's give an average gaming laptop a try and then see if we can dive below the minimum recommended specs and try it on my teeny tiny ITX rig that doesn't even have a dedicated graphics card at all. Hello again, I am Blunty, and despite it being a simple concept, this video was in fact a small pain in the bum to get done behind the scenes, so do you think you'd be kind enough to cheer me up just a little bit, pop a friendly comment, give the old thumb button a nice high five, and do the rest of the algorithm-pleasing, feeding crap YouTubers feel like we have to beg for in a dehumanizing, soul-ripping way? So, very few people have rigs capable of running this thing to its absolute bleeding edge of, say, 4K, 60 plus FPS, ultra settings, highest potential right now. That's pretty much always true when a new flight sim comes out. They are built to kind of overshoot currently available hardware. It's pretty much par for the course as far as these things go, but more people are noticing with this particular flight simulator because for the first time ever, a flight sim is reaching far beyond the usual enthusiast audiences. It's gobsmackingly good-looking graphics, it's groundbreaking technologies, and more than anything else, the fact that it is included with Xbox Game Pass, so even the slightly curious gamer can give it a try with a very low price of entry, or zero price of entry if they're already an Xbox Game Pass subscriber. It has brought so many more eyeballs to a product that for the last few decades has spent its life in the realm of, well, let's be fair, super dorks, aeronautic enthusiasts, and actual pilots, but very few just regular gamers. The good news is, high settings, 1080p, 60 FPS, is an achievable target for most modern gaming PCs. From the inquiries of people in my flight sim streams I've done over the last week, I've talked to them about what hardware they're running on and what settings and stuff, I can pretty safely say that if you've got a decent CPU from the last 5 or so years, you should be fine on that front, and something like a GTX 970 or better will get you a decent experience at middle-of-the-road settings. I've been running on a much more powerful rig, a 12-core, 24-thread Ryzen 9 3900X paired with a Radeon VII. That Radeon VII sure is a noisy bugger, by the way, when you kick its ribs in. Damn blower fans. But it is enough to get me a 1440p experience with nearly everything turned up to ultra and maintain, well, 45 to 80 FPS depending on location and conditions. In most places it's nailed right around 60, where I like it best, and it looks amazing. So, first step along the path to see how low we can go, I popped it into my 2-year-old gaming laptop. It's a Lenovo Legion Y530, 15-inch. It has an Intel Core i7-8750H, which is, no slouch in its own right, but it is a laptop CPU. It is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU. It's teamed up with an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 mobile GPU and a lovely 1080p screen. Flight Sim auto-detected all of this and defaulted to what it calls its high-end settings, one step below Ultra in other words, and, well, pretty much nailed it. No real need to fiddle or fine-tune, really. But back on the matter of frame rate, when it comes to flight sims, the old PC gamer standby of targeting 60 FPS and laughing at 30 FPS console peasants isn't actually that important, or not as important as it is in most regular games. Flying is about smooth, deliberate, consistent, and predictable movements rather than sort of high twitch reaction speeds like in shooter games or something like that. Now, if this was a military fighter jet thing, that might be a different situation, but it's not. In fact, as I was doing my research in the lead-up to Microsoft Flight Sim's launch, I found out that many sort of hardcore simulator fans are actually satisfied with as little as 25 FPS. Outrageous by gamer standards. No one would stand for it. But so long as it's consistent, these flight sim nerds will kind of accept it. I'm not that guy, though. my gamer roots go too deep. So from my experience so far on my main rig, as I've been fiddling with graphic settings, I've been targeting an average of 45 FPS. I found this will get me at least 30 FPS in the most difficult areas and up to about 80 in the easy to render spots, and present a generally smooth and pleasant experience overall, especially with either G-Sync or FreeSync taking care of the monitor refresh to take care of any tearing artifacting. And as you can see, we're right in the butter zone on the Lenovo laptop in my prime test city, the good old hometown of Sydney, Australia. I found that this is actually a pretty good test spot. It's not too plain and not too complex. It's got a nice little mix of generated and custom buildings inside, like the airport's custom, it's got the Opera House down there, and most of the city is auto-generated, and anyway, it makes a good test site. And I found out that if I can get 60 FPS here over Sydney, it's a pretty good sign I'm where I want to be with my settings, that other locations will work quite nicely. But to push it harder, my other main test site has been New York City at night. Lots and lots of geometry and lights in a busy and dense city, huge plop of trees in the middle there with lots of foliage and several bits of custom landmarks scattered around the place. I'm looking for at least 30 FPS here. And with the laptop, I nearly get there with its defaulted high-end settings, but it does drop to as low as 20 FPS, which some flight simmers would find acceptable. And you know what? At about 25 FPS, I'm still okay. If I'm not watching the FPS counter, it feels just fine, but you know, it hurts my gamer soul a little bit. And to my eye, I certainly can tell when it drops below that 30. So if I were going to play regularly here on this hardware, I'd want to pull back on just one or two settings to get there. And there are a few settings you can pull back on without doing noticeable damage to the visual experience. But most interestingly of all in my experiments was when I tried to run it on a system that doesn't even have a dedicated GPU at all. Hardware so close to potato that even the application itself tried to warn me when I went to start it up. This little critter is crammed in a case that's barely more than 3 litres in volume. That's 1,000 cubic centimetres smaller than my Xbox One X. It's powered by a Ryzen V 3400G, which is a 4-core CPU, or more correctly, an APU, because it has built into it a Radeon Vega 11 graphics chipset, which in loose terms is somewhere in the performance ballpark of a discrete GPU like a GTX 1030 or an RX 550, which, while hardly a monster of raw power and generally not what a gamer would choose, it's nonetheless impressive considering it's built right into the CPU. In fact, every time I've used this rig to test games, I've been impressed by just how hard this tiny little bugger can kick. The Ryzen 5 3400G really is very impressive, especially for an asking price of around $200. However, under the monstrous weight of Flight Simulator 2020, as you can see, even this little engine that could had to groan under the load. With the install defaulting to 1080p and low-end settings, even at takeoff, before I even flew into the city proper, I was struggling to get even 15 FPS, and it was so stuttery it was pretty much unplayable. So, step 1 into making it playable was to narrow down where my choke point was. Dropping down to 720p to make it throw around quite a few less pixels seemed like a good idea. One of the bigger limitations with an APU is the fact that it has to share system RAM between the CPU and GPU components. In this case, I've got 8GB on board, and that gives the CPU 6GB and the GPU just 2. Which for a GPU at this performance level is usually quite adequate. But 2GB of VRAM is not much for a simulator trying to draw planet Earth all the way to the horizon. And sure enough, at 720p we can reach 30 FPS in Sydney, but I already know that means I won't be getting anything useful in New York, so let's see what else we can do. The lowest widescreen aspect resolution available is 720 by 480, which is, well, it's not pretty, is it? For the older millennials and those of us in Gen X, this will look a bit familiar to back in the day stuff, eh? Look at all those pixels. Look at them all. You also might notice it's not actually rendering in widescreen properly. Despite being a widescreen aspect ratio, the gauges are obviously a little bit stretched. Not entirely sure what's going on there, but we are damn close to 30 FPS in New York, even at night. And it feels pretty consistent and smooth enough to make actual flight experience come up to a good enough level. And, at least if you're used to them, the gauges are all still reasonably readable. I wouldn't want to try and learn them like this, though. And of course, with the cockpits that have screens instead of dials, you'll probably struggle quite hard. So, fairly limited experience here, but it works. But again, considering this hardware is pushing it without even the benefit of a dedicated discrete GPU, and while the CPU component just smacks above the minimum recommended specs of a Ryzen 3 1200, which is a similarly 4-core CPU unit just like this is, but clocked slobber and from sort of, well, half a generation behind, we'll say, because AMD are weird like that. And of course, the Vega 11 GPU component is weaker than the minimum recommended AMD GPU of an RX 570. Not actually that much weaker, actually, but still measurably weaker. But given all that, I'm still surprised we got to playable. But we're not done yet. I can do better than this, I promise you. There's more tricks to make this better. Check this out. If we snap back to 1080p, you're thinking, oh, that's crazy. You're crazy. 720p didn't even work properly. Bear with me. 1080p, but we'll slump the render scaling down to 50%. Doing that, we keep the pressure off the GPU enough so that it can still throw sufficient amounts of 3D stuff around, so we can get to 30 FPS or so. But with the native resolution bumped up, we get a huge improvement to the readability of the user interface. The cockpit dials, being 3D rendered, are still a bit fuzzy, but in the external chase camera view, they're actually as crispy as they should be at native 1080p, making it far easier to fly. And back in Sydney, we're nearly nailed to 30 FPS with this mix. Sure, you're not going to get the sightseeing splendor that this game can give users at high or ultra settings. Hell, even medium looks pretty damn nice actually, but with a more limited draw distance. But here, at low-end settings, 1080p with 50% render scale, we've hit a place that is at least practical. The physics of flying is all still there. The ability to navigate correctly and read instrument panels and everything else actually important and vital to flying is, in fact, working just fine. Nice, smooth, consistent, easy. Now, I doubt many out there will have dreams of running Flight Sim 2020 on a miniature ITX build with an APU and a cooler so low profile even overclocking is a pretty bad idea, but it's still impressive that it can be done. And also it makes the point that most people out there interested in this game on even middle-of-the-road gaming PCs from the last few years have a damn good chance to run this sim surprisingly well. Because obviously if I can get this thing to do it, your actual built-to-be-a-gamer rig should be fine. Like I said at the start, I've seen lots of people concerned about if their machine can run this. And while it's true, if you want to run this at high or even ultra settings at 1440p or 4K or multi-screen, yeah, you're gonna need a flame-spitting dragon of a rig to get there. But if even my 2-year-old laptop can reach for high-end settings at 1080p without exploding into flames, and AMD's little APU that can, technically at least, get to playable, I'd not worry too much and just give it a go. And of course, we are still in week 1. This game is what you'd refer to as a live service. It is going to improve over time. They are going to make it more optimized as time rolls on. So this is worst case scenario stuff. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty. Thank you as always to the patrons floating up above there. You are kind and generous and glorious people, and you make a lovely difference to this whole content creating malarkey. See you next time.